Hi, everyone. My name's Kelly Scott Reed. For those of you who don't know me or are unfamiliar with me, I'm the Assistant Editor Chief of Ruffin Press and host of A Word, our YouTube channel, where I interview creatives, writers, poets, and those who make the magic that makes this life worth living. I'm happy to welcome Jenny Wong, a writer, traveler, and occasional business analyst. Jenny's been published many times in RF as her work delivers a deep and unique insight of what it means to be human. Her favorite places to wander are Tokyo alleys, Singapore hawker centers, and Parisian cemeteries. Her work has been nominated for the Pushcart Prize, the Best of the Net Anthology, Best Small Fiction Awards, and the Forward Prize, Best Single Poem Written. She resides in Canada near the Rocky Mountains. Her debut chapbook, Shiftings and Other Coordinates of Disorder, is now available to order at Pinhole Poetry. Welcome to A Word, Jenny. It's so nice to finally meet you in person.
Thank you, Kelly. It's so nice to meet you too. And thank you again for this opportunity. It's very awesome to be here virtually.
Virtually. I know. I wish it could be different. This has afforded me the opportunity to meet people such as you. Your writing really connects with me and with a lot of our editors at RF. We've all commented. It really connects across a wide spectrum of people, your experiences. And with this new chapbook, Shiftings and Other Coordinates of Disorder, could you give us a little overview of just what your ideas were here, how you put this chapbook together?
Yeah. So over the years, I've always had this thing where I wanted to do like a full-length manuscript. And so this chapbook actually did start as a full-length manuscript. I'm like, okay, I'm going to gather a bunch of poems and I'm going to try and do this. And I ended up a very early version of the manuscript had 3 sections called Shiftings, Disorders, and Coordinates. And as I went on, some poems weren't ready, some poems didn't fit, and some poems I just didn't seem to have the feel that I wanted. So I ripped a bunch of poems out and got it down to like a chapbook size. And at that size, I'm like, I don't need headings anymore. And so I knew the right decision was to take those out. Shiftings was kind of the poems in the sections of Shiftings were like my feelings of restlessness and just kind of uncomfortableness with like sometimes how I feel in the world and my surroundings. And Disorder is more of like there's like a couple of poems in this thing where you just have random like August storms and just stuff that happens and you're just kind of like, oh, okay. And then Coordinates are more of my travel poems, so just different parts of the world. um, so once I had gotten everything boiled down to the poems that I really loved and I thought belonged together, there wasn't a lot of them, so I kind of had to pull out those section headers, and I didn't want to do it because I thought it would be lacking something, because those were the threads that tied my initial gathering of all these together. So I took them, you can probably see where this is going. I took them and made them into the title, Shiftings and Other Coordinates of Disorder. And that's the threads that kind of bind this whole chapbook together. And that's kind of how I picked them.
So you're talking about traveling and also how you don't fit in. I find that interesting, where you sometimes feel like you don't fit in your
Mhm.
surroundings, because as a traveler, by its very nature, you're a stranger in the
Yes.
places that you are. I think of Anthony Bourdain, the first thing that came to my mind, who is one of my favorite human beings that has ever been. And I think of that. And do your when you're traveling, um, and you're writing about those places, when in your coordinates section, or the when you were thinking of that, um, were the poems coming from a feeling that you were having in those places, or was it more about the places themselves?
It's a little bit of both. It depends on the poem. I prefer when I describe my writing, I usually like to call myself, I'm a writer of place. I like that's where my a lot of my inspiration and my creativity comes from. And what usually happens for me is sometimes you're just in a spot, and my brain is normally a little bit more chatty, for lack of a better word. And there's times when I'm just in a spot and the chatter quiets down and I can just exist. I can just be present in the moment. Um, and sometimes I will write about what it is about those places that kind of make me quiet down. A lot of people have said my poems have a quiet aspect to them, and I think that's probably why that is because when I get these inspirations, I am in a quiet place. I finally kind of settled and felt like, okay, I am, this is lovely. This is, you know, I fit for a little bit. Um, but other places, it's just some amazing things that you see. I was One of the poems is about a subterranean art museum in Japan. Like, it's just the fact that you go to a museum underground and there's the walls, but beyond those walls it's just this dirt and this history, and you can kind of feel like there's that scent of like just like the petrichor, like after something rains you just kind of have that like earthy smell, and you're just kind of like, this is different, this is cool, I want to encapsulate that into something and what it means to me and why it's impacting me. um, so that's kind of where some of these poems are coming from.
That's amazing because when you were said you a quiet aspect, I, I am one of the most busy brained and physically busy people I know, and I will agree with that with your work.
Mm.
I have a hard time staying on work. It has to be pretty special for me to connect with it because my brain will take tangents everywhere. And when reading your stuff, it is definitely a very focused experience for me. So that's a compliment to you. That's really, really true. Love that. What was the most surprising thing you learned about yourself while in the process of putting together shiftings?
um, I think one of the most surprising things is, well, I say I'm a writer about a place. There was a secondary aspect that kind of came up in the work and the pieces that I gathered. And my friend had just recently read the collection, and even she picked up on it. So I was like, okay, this is something. And what it is I mentioned a lot about rabbits in my collection, and I never really thought much about it until like I was putting it together. And there's about 3 poems that have rabbits in there, but every time the rabbit appears, there's kind of a shift or a transition in the poetry or the series. So in the very first poem, a rabbit appears. It's painted, it's underground, underneath. Well, it's not underground. It's underneath a bridge. It's graffitied. It's kind of like a caricature of a rabbit. And that poem is when I'm leaving Lisbon and I'm coming home, and it's just kind of like that whole like when you're coming home, you're kind of like this person that you have to show people, and you kind of feel a little bit like stiff, and you're kind of like, hi, I'm this person that you might expect me to be. So that was my shift home. And then the next poem, the rabbit appears, it's October, and the rabbits are readying their body for winter, so they're turning white. And I think there's a bit of thinking about aging a little bit in that, things around us are aging. Not everything is permanent. There is, as you get older, as I get older, I feel that impermanence a lot more. So that's kind of where that poem was shifting the manuscript into, like, just going home and just kind of being wintering, for lack of a better word. And then the last poem is my favorite because it's a haiku, and it's the only haiku in this collection. And it's a rabbit, and it's basically a scene where the rabbit's just like running through a forest, and there's like footprints in the snow. And that's where the manuscript takes off again. It leaves home, and then the rest of the poems after that, they're out in the world. It's hitting different spots, mostly Japan, but also no one will know this if they just read straight the manuscript. But the last poem was Lisbon as well. So they seem to just mimic my feelings at the time, and I didn't really intend to put them in as rabbits, but they seem to work. So it was kind of interesting for me to see that once the collection was put together.
And how did you make the decision on what to include? Because you said you had a large grouping and you were putting them in different categories and different chapter heading. How did you make the decision what to cut? Because I know it's very tough for me and most writers to tell your babies they're not welcome in your
Yeah.
house
Well, I
anymore.
don't tell them they're not welcome. I'm just telling them later. This isn't the right one for you, but you will have a spot later. And they seem to be okay with that. Because sometimes they don't play nice together. Like there's one piece that you love, but it just doesn't work with this other piece, and you're kind of like, well, okay, you're gonna have your spot later, or you're still special, but not in this one. Um, a lot. I took out a lot of poems that I had a lot more travel poems. I had some that were in Italy. I had some that were like some catacombs in Italy. I had some in Mexico as well. There's like cenotes in Mexico that I loved to explore. And I took those out because they didn't have the right feel for the manuscript. And I can't articulate, unfortunately, I can't really articulate it other than when I read through the manuscript, they, they, they felt like they were elsewhere, like literally elsewhere. And I really only mentioned three places in this manuscript. And I thought that was enough. I thought that if I went to too many places, the manuscript would lose its focus. And um, as I said, I kind of eventually it was home, Japan, and Lisbon, and those were the three that ended up. And I felt those pieces talked a lot to each other, and the Lisbon pieces were written around the same time, and the Japan pieces were written around the same time, so they kind of interconnected that way. So timing wise, they made in my brain they made sense, as well as like it was a kind of an encapsulated feel of those that moment or that trip.
You're really it seems like in a lot of there's a seeking aspect to a lot of your work. Do you find that does anybody said that to you before? But I'm just asking. It just seems like there's like a definitely there seems like you're traveling a lot. There's a seeking, an understanding, a curiosity about things because obviously Japan and Lisbon are different, um, probably culturally. So when you're in that mode, are you finding similarities between the cultures that you're going and exploring?
I think so. In some ways, it's just people are just people, no matter where you go. And there are very kind people out there, especially when you're in a country where you don't speak the language, and you kind of do rely on people. Like, you don't necessarily ask for help, but they can tell, and they will just out of the goodness of their heart reach out and help you. And that's a really unique connection, because I find in like Canada and the US, we're very independent. We want to be independent. We want to do everything ourselves. And I feel like we lose a little bit of that community, and that, like, well, we're human beings that need, well, not need, but like connection is kind of a part of it. And I think that's kind of a big thing for me, is like when I travel, I am distancing myself from home, but at the same time, I'm seeking connection elsewhere. And I'm still trying to reconcile that difference, um, of why that is for me. But I do feel like there are similarities in the kindness of people, um, and just the broadening of your mind, like just trying even like new food, for example, that you've just never had before and you've never been exposed to, but it's really good, and you kind of like it's almost got that comfort food feel, even though you've never actually had it before. And that kind of gives you a feeling of like, oh, this is like you belong there too. Um, I for the most part, I think I'm more of a reserved person, so I'm not sure most of the people kind of who meet me face to face would see my restlessness for what it is, and I don't let it out very often. It's kind of like it's kind of my own thing that I work through and I deal with, and I let it out when I travel, because there's no witnesses too, which is another thing.
Yeah, I'm completely a restless person. And one of the reasons I love our press so much is because I get to experience people from, I love people. Like, I'm one of the only people on this planet today, people seem a little jaded against other people. I love them. And it's kind of the joke, like, you really do love every person because I feel everybody has something to offer, right? There's
Mhm.
something to offer that I don't have. For example, like people I meet who are quieter than me, more introspection. I have very little introspection. I am very much an outward extroverted person. And when someone brings me introspection, it feels like I'm connecting on a deeper level, even with myself, just by knowing that person who's a little bit more introspective. And I think that's cool that you're restless, you like you said, but you're finding these connections um, with so many different people and places. I find that great. And I think that it proves writing when you can connect somewhere that's not familiar, um,
Mhm.
and bring the reader into that experience with you. Speaking of helpers, do you have any literary influences? And if not, where you look? What do you look besides travel for inspiration?
Um, I find, well, I always actually find the concept of literary inspirations a little uncomfortable because I don't feel like I'm as well read as um, some other people, and I'm kind of like, I don't want to admit that, but it's kind of true. Um, but I find, especially on Twitter and like small presses like Raw which I adore, because you guys pull so many varied types of work, and stuff that resonates on many different levels and many different voices. It's very great. And I find that's kind of where I'm pulling a lot of my inspiration from. It's like these little smaller, like flash fiction poetry pieces that just kind of float through my Twitter feed. And it sounds interesting, or someone's recommended it that I also like the work that they either write or that they also tend to recommend, and I'll go to there. I remember reading like a one sentence story, and I was just absolutely floored by what that writer had done. And so I think a lot of just everyday people who are writing, we all have our experiences, our voice, our styles, um, what we're trying to accomplish and what we're trying to say. We all have different messages and different feelings of restlessness that and things that we want to get out in the world. So I think my short answer to that is um, just any writing I can read kind of can inspire me. I think it doesn't have to be something big or a big name person, but like just the random neat stuff that's magically, cosmically comes across my plate that I'm meant to read, and it's kind of like, yeah, meant to read that, and that's awesome.
I feel that same way. I get very excited. I'll read something and I'll stand up and get so excited and I'll scream out, to my husband, "Oh my God, this was amazing!" And it is because I too am not the most prolifically well-read person in the world. I don't have a lot of time to sit and read. I love short stories and poetry the
Mhm.
best because I can get impact in a very short amount of time, and I love it. So I get what you're saying when it comes to like, oh, should I be even, do I have any literary influences? Probably not. But the people that I meet every day, such as yourself and the other folks who have come across our Rafinha universe, like the Marvel universe, like we're that big a deal. But, but that kind of thing, like just reading it and going, oh my gosh, that just hit so hard. And it doesn't have to be someone who's been published. Some of the best
Mhm.
stuff we get of people who've never published before. It's their first time. I'm like, that's incredible. And it's this fresh and new. And it's an awesome experience. I like that answer. That's very cool. Um, what's the most helpful criticism you received as a writer?
Well, I wouldn't call it helpful criticism, but while I was getting something heavily criticized, I got the best piece of advice. So I had I can't remember, it was a story or collection. I had something that was a longer body of work, and I had asked someone to read it over for me. Um, and basically, the long story short is there was a lot that needed to be cut. And I'm like, well, how do I decide this? Because it's one thing when you're working on a poem or a piece of flash, you know it needs to be condensed and you know it needs to be deep. But when it gets to a longer work, you're like, but it needs to be longer. And that's in my mind, it's like, well, but then if I cut it, then it kind of goes back to what I've already done. And the person gave me really good advice. They said, follow the heat, and whether it's the passion or the feel. And I have found I have used that so much in my editing. Um, like one of the poems in here, it never got published, and I tried to find a home for it. And it was one of the Japan poems, so it was written in 2017. So all throughout that time frame, I had tweaked it and worked on it and tried to get it published. And when I got it into this collection, I had made drastic changes because I was finally ready to follow what the heat of that poem was. And so I like cut out a stanza, and I put in like a footnote, if you can believe it. I actually tried to use a footnote in this, and I feel like it worked, mirroring. There's like a skyway in Kyoto, and you're looking down at people, and so there's the perspective from the skyway, and then the footnote is all the details of what you might see in the crowd. And I thought that's what I was trying to capture this whole time, but I was wrapping it in like stanzas and trying to, shift it everywhere. And it just needed to be one stanza boiled down. That was the heat of the poem. Um, and then what I really wanted to show in the crowds, the little beautiful pieces of people floating in the crowd, the sea of people that I wanted to show. So
Oh, I love that so much. I love that. I'm gonna steal it in my own head and use it. I think that's great.
go for
It's
it.
classic. What does literary success look like to you?
For me, literary successes, well, I think of it as success as plural. Every first, and that's what I love about writing. I find every little first I have is a success to me. My first time submitting, that's the big step, right? That's like, okay, I'm ready to get rejected pretty much. You're ready to move on. So like your first submission, your first publication, that's very dear. um, your first time trying something new, like your first poem published versus your first short story published, um, and your first like award nomination. That's great. So I kind of work in like little first. If it's a first, I'm like, that's success to me. And lately it's been like a couple of years ago was my first short story, or my first short poetry film publication, or while I'm publishing myself, but my first short poetry film gets sent out into the world. So it's kind of, for me, success is these little firsts, I call them, where I've never had that happen with my work, or my work has never done something like that for me or for itself. So I guess big literary success. I don't know, maybe when I run out of firsts, then maybe I'm done, but I don't think I ever will. Like, I think it's something to keep, like, that's what I love about it. You can always keep going, and you can always find another first, another success that you can try and get. And I think that helps me, because if I had once a long time ago this big goal of like, I'm gonna write a novel, and it's still in the works. So, but just having, and I'm not sure if I had done it, if I would have been happy with it, because the successes I've found are on the journey, and I think that's important, that we have to remember it's not always about the goal, but these little pieces of joy, and these little pieces of acknowledgement and recognition, and you're kind of like, yeah, that's cool, and then you move on.
Oh, like you're quotable, Jenny.
Oh.
I'm like, as you're talking, I'm like, oh, that's another good one. Fantastic. I love that. The firsts. We published lactic acid, and it's
Thank
also in your book.
you. Mhm.
Could you talk to us a little bit about the piece? Where did it come from, and what feeling does it bring up when you revisit it?
This actually circles really well back to the first question. So, lactic acid was written in Lisbon, very first night we had arrived, and so of course jet lag happens. And at 5:30 in the morning, being wide awake, nothing to do, so I get out of bed and I go to the window. And our apartment was on the third floor, and it overlooked the restaurant and shopping street, which is like bustling during the day. Like there's restaurant chatter and people shopping, and tourists going by, and you can hear the luggage rolling across the cobblestones. But at 5:30 in the morning, it was quiet. And again, this goes back to those quiet moments. And I felt that quietness just kind of seeped into me a bit. And as I'm watching the street, no one's on it. And, you feel that calm. And I began to wonder, what is it about travel that makes me just kind of have these calm moments, these quiet moments? And there's a sentence came into my head, which is kind of the truest answer I've found for myself personally, um, like ever in all of my years of traveling. And it was something in my bones looking for home. And that is the last line in the poem. And I didn't reach for my notebook or my phone right away. I just kind of like was like, yes, that hits home for me. That hits the truth of kind of why I'm so the way I am right now. And so every time I read the poem or think about that poem, I'm taken back to that little apartment on the third floor in Lisbon at 5:30 in the morning. And I I'm very fortunate that people like you and other readers have actually connected with that poem because it is a very personal poem for me. I talk about my toenails, which is something I would never do in like a regular conversation either, right? But it was a very personal poem to me, but I feel very fortunate that people have still, even though it's personal, have connected with it. And you yourself and the press have seen something in there worth sharing, which I'm very grateful for as well.
Well, I just want to thank you for this conversation. It really has been awesome.
Oh,
It
thank you.
really has been. I'm
Good.
moved, just like I am when I read your work. You do make connections. You do make really deep connections with your work. And I want to thank you for that. Can you show us? Do you have your book that you can hold up? And you have to talk while you're doing it. So I get it off the screen and you're on.
This is the book. I want to do a shout out to Pinhole Poetry as well because they did an absolute stunning job of it. Even just listening to what the poetry had to say and what I wanted to. I'll crack it open because one of my favorite details is the fly leaves that Erin had included, and
Oh,
they
it's
are gorgeous.
gorgeous.
It is gorgeous, but this
Yes,
is actually a map of Lisbon. And on the back is a map
beautiful.
of somewhere in Japan. And so she literally like she understood what was happening in the work. And it
That's
wasn't until my
beautiful.
launch. Yeah, and the street signs are in Japanese. So I knew it was in Japan, but I didn't know where. And during my launch party, she finally told me it's probably the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. And Tokyo is one of my favorite cities. And I was just like, yes, that's perfect. So um,
Oh my gosh, Jenny, that's beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. And I'm so happy for you. That is absolutely gorgeous. Thank you for sharing it with us. In our notes for the show, we will have where you can find it, where you can order it, and a link to it. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a real honor. Thank you.
thank you, Kelly. It's been wonderful talking to you as well. Thank you so much.